The opening sequence of episode 62 features, yep, that's right, another cold open that takes us way back in time to when Reiner was a wee young lad. Before we get stuck into the analysis though, I think this episode mostly revolves around two major ideas. One is about the role of the walls, as in, was it meant to keep the Paradisians in, or the Marleyans out? And the same idea kind of applies to Liberio. But the second one is the somewhat stereotypical saying of, be careful what you wish for. Chasing dreams can turn out to be very, very dangerous. Both of these paradoxes, or sort of contradictions, color most of Attack on Titan, and we've already seen very explicit examples of that, but with this particular episode, it's like the central pillar for most of what we'll be seeing. So with that in mind, we open with Reiner's mom talking about how the Paradisians abandoned them, saying that is why they're forced to live in the walled internment zones. I don't think that needs much elaboration. The walls of Paradis and the walls of Liberio are not at all that different, and all of this is just Marley propaganda. We already talked about this last time with the Reiner dinner sequence, but if you want to talk about brainwashed characters, even before you talk about the warriors, Karina should be like prime example number one. On one hand, drilling Marley propaganda into Reiner is just her protecting her son, since, you know, we saw what happens when you try to rebel with Grisha and Faye, and that was pretty bad. So purely from a human empathetic point of view, I don't think anyone can really fault her for that. Obviously, she just wants her son to be safe, and she will do whatever it takes to make sure that he is safe. But on the other hand, she is also the clearest example of why this kind of oppression is basically impossible to tear down. As soon as Reiner becomes a warrior, she just puts on blinders to the fact that they are still treated as subhuman and as the other in the Marley population. They have created this arbitrary definition of a quote-unquote honorary Marleyan because it simply allows them to scapegoat the Paradisians and the Eldians for all of their problems. Instead of actually focusing on the top brass of Marley as the ones, oppressing them, they can instead think about the big bad Eldians on the faraway island that have caused all of their problems. It's just a very convenient narrative that basically works as a distraction. In this sort of population hierarchy, Karina is just a useful fool. She has been given a few breadcrumbs to just keep her from asking the question of, where's the bread though? From Reiner's perspective though, from the moment he is born, he is told that he is not even human, he is a devil and that the world hates him. But in that cold and bleak world that she presents him with, there is a glimmer of hope. His crying mother, she could be happy, they could reunite with his long-lost father. All he has to do is become a warrior. That is it. At this point in time, there is no subtext. Every child wants their parents to be happy, he just wants him and his mom to live a normal life. And of course, transpose that sentence to Eren, and the walls of Liberio and Paradis seem a lot more similar. With both of their stories, that mother's love is the core theme, and one that we would return to countless times throughout their stories. Eventually though, for Reiner, that desire does of course become not just to save his mother, but the Eldian people as a whole, which, again, is the same exact thing with Eren. The big thing here that is not at all like Eren though, is of course the stark contrast between Karina and Carla. With Eren's mom, there was no if only. To her, he was special for no other reason than being born. She didn't want him to fight, she didn't need to be saved from anything. She was happy exactly where she was because she had her special little boy. And right between Eren and Reiner, we of course also have Willy Tybur, but okay, we'll get to that in due time. Also, similar to what we saw with Gabby, we have that same visual transition of Kid Reiner in the warm and safe home to the cold loneliness that is now his life. The color and the fire within him has gone out. And speaking of which, we then move into Reiner's training, which is essentially another inversion of the training arc back on Paradis, but also a direct mirror. In Season 1, we saw Eren's squad after they had already lost everything and they joined the military to fight in the name of humanity. With Reiner on the other hand, there is no initial goal whatsoever beyond a simple, I need to save my family. Reiner didn't lose anything, he was born with nothing essentially. But the thing is, we know that for Eren, the goal of quote-unquote saving humanity also fell away, and what eventually mattered most was just his friends on Paradis. With Reiner, it's the inverse. Once he became a warrior, he was genuinely sold the idea that he is going to free the Eldian people as a whole. So it's more like a figure 8 story, almost looks like an infinity because Eren's story is a loop, right? Get it? It's funny. Like I've said before though, this weird insistence on everything having to be like a direct parallel or direct mirror is a very big trap for Attack on Titan fans for some reason. So while I do liken them, there is obviously wiggle room there, especially with the question of, maybe I was born this way, that we'd explore later. It's just similar themes, similar circumstances that manifest in similar but also very, very different ways. And on that note, we got to Magath and the warrior training, which is of course another example of similar but very different. With the warrior training, it's basically a free-for-all. They are all pushed to their breaking points. Instead of collaboration, it pushes competition to single out the most durable and dedicated ones. That is in stark contrast to the soldier training back on Paradis. There, we even got explicit scenes of Reiner helping out Armin so that he doesn't get caught. And the thing is, even though Armin and Reiner talk about how, oh, we shouldn't get caught, Keith clearly sees them and it's totally fine. There is a degree of we need to weed out the weak just to protect them, because like, if they're weak and we sort of just allow them to do whatever they want, they're probably just gonna die, and that's gonna be bad for everyone involved. But in this situation, it's an example of camaraderie. It's not like Armin is totally useless, so Keith is like, yeah, I'm gonna push Armin a bit more, but if Reiner's helping him, then so be it. We will have this exact thing happen on the battlefield. Visually, it is also very similar, but also very different. With both, we see them trucking through the mud as rain pours down. But the color palette and the overall atmosphere is entirely different. Even further accentuated by the following scene where the sun is already shining and the scouts all zip around with their ODM gear. Ditto for the music, Ashes on the Fire and DOA obviously have very, very different vibes.
Run, you filthy seed of swine!
And a small thing to note here, even as we change scenes, with us then cutting to Zeke and the candidates, Ashes on the Fire still continues to play, which might seem kinda odd considering how different the scenes are supposed to be. I think what it's trying to do is create the sense of constant escalation in the sequence as a whole. We are made to feel like we are forcefully just being pushed along through this entire history. That said though, it is time to overanalyze because Zeke is holding onto an apple as he cheerily says they'll soon be shipped off to Paradis. One interpretation here is that the apple symbolizes true desire, one that Zeke now has in his grasp. As we see throughout his flashback, securing the Founding Titan so that he can go through with his euthanasia plan is his one and only purpose in life. So inheriting the beast and joining the long-awaited Paradis campaign is basically everything he wanted. If you continue overanalyzing, this would also make sense with him throwing the apple to Marcel. Or, in other words, it slips from his fingers, since, as we obviously see, he isn't actually deployed with Reiner's original squad and is only sent 4 more years down the line. Which, by the way, I know the question of why wasn't he deployed right from the get-go often pops up, and I think it's actually quite simple. Most likely, he wasn't in the initial deployment because he's just straight up too OP. During the Paradis campaign, Marley was still engaged in all kinds of shenanigans in the rest of the world. So with them having sent 4 whole shifters to the island, Zeke and Peak were held back just for other conflicts. I mean, Zeke transforming Eldians could literally solo entire nations, so, you know, yeah, you probably want to hold him back if you're going to be actively engaging other nations. That said, there is also a different angle here that is also very much overanalyzing. The apple here could be false hope, and that inheriting their Titan is basically a deal with the devil. Like, think about it, these are kids cheering about dying in 13 years, which you know, definitely seems like a pretty unfavorable deal to me. We see very similar imagery with Ymir and the Devil of All Things, so I think that very much tracks with the whole Garden of Eden / corrupted temptations / dark influences type vibe that this entire thing is going for. I guess you could even stretch the idea further and say that Zeke is the devil, offering the temptation of the apple, and is actually the one leading them to slaughter, since, you know, the euthanasia plan. Apples aside, another important throughline in this episode is that blind loyalty that has been drilled into Reiner. With Porco saying that, he's never getting picked for his skills or abilities or anything like that. The only reason why he's gotten this far is his constant babbling about their great nation. And we get this great parallel here of Reiner immediately locking in and accusing him of being an Eldian restorationist. Something we of course also saw in the previous episode with him scolding Falco. Only there, it's clear that Reiner doesn't believe what he's saying and is only doing it to protect him. Here on the other hand, he does believe this himself. And another great subversion here is the fact that Kid Reiner is not the tough guy we know on Paradis. Among the warriors, he is kind of a weakling that is being pushed around by basically everyone. Even his supposedly super spicy Eldia restorationist accusation is completely dismissed. Porco basically just says that anyone can repeat Marley's propaganda just like Reiner does and that he is a super easy replacement. He's just further deconstructing our assumptions about who Reiner was and is. If he was like this when he was a kid, how did he end up reaching the wall and ended up being the stone-cold warrior that we saw? It just doesn't add up. There is something we're missing, and we would of course see what we're missing very, very shortly. We also see a few small-scale examples of Marcel's leadership, with him briefly staying behind to apologize, so I think that's just a nice bit of characterization considering we don't really see much of Marcel, but he is very important for Reiner. Though what I think is the most interesting bit of characterization is what we see with Annie just standing there and smushing the grasshopper/cricket, I don't know what it's supposed to be. Throughout the series, and even long after the series, people have been debating whether or not Annie truly showed remorse, whether she was in fact the worst of the Marley shifters, etc, etc. People raise lots of arguments, but most of all, it just comes down to the question of whether or not she has sadistic traits. I mean, she was yo-yoing scouts. In previous videos, I've talked about how, personally, I always think it's just bias, as we have spent more time with Reiner and Bertolt, so viewers also excuse a whole lot more of their actions. It's what I call getting lost in the sauce, in the same way that a lot of people seem to be very lost in the sauce with Eren's story. Not to rehash all that again, I want to briefly look at this disturbing side of Annie. An Annie that will get lost in her own thoughts as she just smushes bugs. An Annie that will yo-yo scouts and ruthlessly crush dozens with her own two hands as opposed to some abstract breaking of the wall. The way I look at it is that Annie's father pushed her so incredibly hard that, for her, there is no victory state. The only point at which the fight is actually done for her is when her opponents are crushed with no recourse whatsoever. We see that with her very first victory against her dad. Only when she knocked him down and kept kicking him over and over and over did he finally smile. That was the very first time in her entire life that she was shown true affection. And so chasing that fleeting bit of affection, she will thoroughly crush anything and anyone that stands in her way. And perhaps most importantly, because of just how ruthless her training and really life as a whole had been thus far, Marley propaganda doesn't even register. To her, Eldians and Marleyans are the same kind of self-absorbed liars who only care about themselves, with her saying, "I am no different." If the way of the world is Marley crushing and subjugating all opposition, she will gladly do the same thing in her own personal interests. To her, morality and ethics, they're a joke that only the weak tell themselves to just cope with the world. So, is she sadistic? By definition, no, I don't think so. I rather think that she has just internalized that cruelty of the world and considers this to just be pragmatic. If you wanted to make like a tier list of misery, Eren, he had loving parents and a very chill childhood. Reiner had a loving mother, but no chill childhood. Annie, she had neither. So I think crushing weakness is just her way of coping with the world. In the final season, and after many pseudo-therapeutic sessions with Armin, we do see her realize the value of life and people in general. So yeah, I think saying that she actually derives pleasure, which is what sadistic actually means, from yo-yoing scouts is very goofy. Especially considering that she was bawling her eyes out with Marco and is also the only one who doesn't try to put up some weird wall of "these are not our friends." No, she just says, "Reiner, you're going to kill a bunch of your friends." But the final thing in this little opening bit is Blaze-Rod and Reiner talking about Reiner's goal. This is where that parallel, but also mirror to Eren, is really solidified. Essentially, Reiner talks about defeating the devils of Paradis and becoming a hero for the Eldian people. And as he says this, the camera pans up to the wall. And a quick transition later, we see Eren too looking up at a wall, just saying, "I wish something interesting would happen." So, if I can quote Under the Tree, with both of them, it's that question of, your dream, did it satisfy or terrify? Eren being a nothing ever happens enjoyer backfires really bad, and Reiner's dream obviously turns out to be a nightmare, and then Eren's long-term dream turns out to be a nightmare as well, and Reiner's entire life turns out to be a nightmare. And again, it further deconstructs the quote-unquote good guys and quote-unquote bad guys. The supposed good guy is bored out of his mind saying, "I wish something would happen." The quote-unquote bad guy, though, has already lived an entire lifetime of misery and oppression. And that neatly takes us to the title of the episode, Gateway to Hope. I think the most straightforward interpretation here is that it refers to the revolving door that is Reiner's dream. Essentially, we would see that gateway close and close and close until there is no gateway at all, and we'll talk all about that throughout this episode. Moving into said episode, we open with yet another sequence that looks awfully similar to Just Recap. It is recap, just like we saw with Gabby, because normal people don't obsess over the series, and it's been a long time since we've seen all the Titans, and all the Titans would all clash in LEMMiNO, so you need to understand what they do. That's why the recap is here. The only sus part is that it also recaps Annie, but Annie is a gun on the wall, and one of you introduced the concept of a musket on the wall, which means like it's now outdated, and I really like that. So Annie is, yes, she is now a musket on the wall. That said though, there are a few things I want to note here. I know there is still some confusion about the female Titan, as we see relatively little of her actually in action. But her primary ability, that they refer to as quote-unquote adaptability, is actually mimicking the other Titan shifters. She was like actually fed other parts of the Titan shifters and could replicate weaker forms of their abilities. It's super fundamental magic stuff, so we obviously don't ever find out like the ins and outs of all of it, but is that mimicking ability that actually made her ludicrously powerful. It's not just that she can adapt to situations or her combat skills or anything like that. All of those are very great things, sure, but her Titan is also quite literally the most versatile. She can harden like the Armor Titan, she can call on other Titans like the Founding Titan. Her transformations are very big, almost like the Colossal. Which, by the way, I still think her not counteracting Eren's future sight is a huge missed opportunity, but that's beside the point, and no, I have no idea how that would even work. That said though, there is actually one more missed opportunity here that I think happens with Zeke, Marley's so-called Golden Boy or Miracle Boy. As we've discussed before, Zeke's core philosophy draws on Arthur Schopenhauer and antinatalism. Or, in other words, the belief that life as a whole is suffering and that the creation of life is cruel and immoral. So, what I think would have been, I don't want to say interesting because it's like insanely messed up and probably would have been actually censored out of existence, but, well, it would be kind of interesting, is if Marley strongly recommended Zeke to have children as an attempt to replicate his extraordinary Beast Titan abilities. They even say that there is something special about his blood. So, while they don't know that his blood is in fact royal blood, they do suspect that there is something genetic going on. So, considering Zeke's philosophy is all about not wanting kids in any capacity, I think Marley recommending it would have made for really compelling storytelling. That said though, I do think it's just kind of outside of the scope of what Isayama was trying to do. Back on Paradis, Historia's pregnancy and the royal child there is also used as a more subtle storytelling device to convey ideals rather than like actual plot points. Her child being born has nothing to do with the Titans. If anything, it is deliberately detached from all the Titan stuff. Okay, I've talked about that before, I'm not going to talk about it now. Moving on to the Colossal, once again, the obligatory, why didn't it always create the nuke? The answer is very simple, he has control over his transformations. He can do the big nuke like we saw in Shiganshina, or he can be more stealthy, which is not really stealthy because it's still the Colossal, but we have seen that many times as well. And the final thing here is a question that probably a lot of us in the audience asked as well, but it is also addressed in universe. That being, why are we sending kid soldiers? You might have noticed that in a ton of anime, there are many young characters whose actions just don't match their age like at all. In most cases, that is just pure marketing to appeal to the biggest demographic of high school age boys. That is why like every other anime happens in a high school even though it has nothing to do with high school. Jotaro being 17 is like the perfect example of that because like, yeah, he definitely looks and talks and acts like a 17-year-old, for sure. I remember when I was 17 and I looked just like Jotaro. But in Attack on Titan's case, while I do think there might have been some of that like super early because that's just how manga usually goes, I don't really think it has anything to do with marketing or audience segmentation. In story, we see that brainwashed kids with Titans can be powerful enough to wipe out entire nations. And the best part is, they don't ask any questions because they're dumb little kids. Reiner screaming about the great Marleyan nation is just convenient. Adult Zeke working to overthrow Marley from within is really bad. And so, you send in young soldiers with a 13-year term, and by the time they realize that they might in fact be the baddies, well, time's up. Speaking of all the Titan recap though, another thing to remember is that while we obviously know that Reiner gets the Armored, in-universe, it was always meant to go to Porco. Considering how much more resilient Porco is and how Reiner just gets pushed around, I think that's another subtle question that the show asks the audience. As in, why do you think Reiner seems very different when we meet him? What changed? And on that note, Marcel apologizes to Reiner. In this particular scene, the implication is that he is just apologizing for his brother since Reiner is now superior to Porco. In reality though, he's apologizing for well, dooming Reiner because he sabotaged Porco. We'll return to this point in just a minute, so hold that thought. The thing I really want to overanalyze here are the maps in the background. The left one is almost certainly Paradis, but the right one is the one that really intrigues me. The sea is to the west, so it's definitely not Liberia or the nearby Africa regions. It does kinda sorta look like it could be around the Mediterranean, but it doesn't really line up perfectly. Maybe it could be around like the western parts of Africa, but there it doesn't really line up either? Actually, you know what? On second thought, maybe I shouldn't be analyzing a weird background blurry map. Maybe that is a waste of time. This series is very detail-centric, yes, but when they put in a random Steam screenshot in the background, maybe I'm paying a little bit too much attention. By the way, this is not one of my memes, this is actually in the episode. This is a Steam screenshot that was used as a painting. Do not ask me how that happened. We see the new warriors paraded in the streets, which is of course yet another mirror to the scouts who return to insults, angry mothers and fathers, and were generally viewed as just wasting precious resources. But because Marley has created this dichotomy of good and bad Eldians, there is suddenly a lot to celebrate. This is Attack on Titan though, so we've had our little happy moment. Now, it is all downhill from here. Reiner's naive little brain thinks that now he has his title, his mom and dad could finally get back together. He runs to him and cheerily proclaims that he's done it. He is an honorary Marleyan, they can be a family now. But nothing has changed. He is met with the same exact hatred. His father asking him whether this is some sick punishment. This is Reiner's first wake-up moment that this hatred toward the Eldian people has no rational thought or rules behind it. It's just blind prejudice, and that is it. Logic has never stopped hatred, and neither will an arbitrary title. As his mind blanks, we cut to him already on the ship to Paradis. His mom happily waving him goodbye as his view of the world has already changed fundamentally. If him becoming a warrior meant leaving his mother completely alone, then was that even the right choice? What if he completes the mission? What if he defeats all the island devils? Will the Eldian people still have devil's blood in their veins? Will anything change? As the walls close in on Reiner, the very ominous and fittingly named Nowhere to Go plays in the background. As we already saw back in Season 2, Eren is not the only walking contradiction in the series. As much as Reiner saw point blank that Marley's propaganda is pure fiction and that there is nothing honorable about it, there is still that naive kid inside of him that truly believes that he can save their world. And so, we cut to them camping on Paradis, with Bear Spray asking how can they be sure that the king won't use the Founding Titan if they attack the wall. There's a whole back and forth between Reiner and Band-Aid here, so let's just go over the actual mission. First things first, and this is actually like super big, I only learned about this recently myself, the anime cut a ton of scenes from this flashback. Most of them add just a few lines of extra flavor text and such, but the crucial line here is Reiner explicitly mentioning the Tibers' family's information. In the anime, Reiner just mentions vague Marley research, and Tiber only pops up in Liberia, where the fact that all of this is just a bluff is actually revealed. So based on purely the anime, Marley's mission was actually a huge gamble. They weren't sure that nothing would happen. Obviously, aside from Fritz himself, the Tiber family are the only ones to know that the vow to renounce war exists. The rest of the world genuinely perceive the rumbling as the real deal. So in the manga, if Tiber was already involved in some capacity, the goal of watching for the king's reaction seems to have a lot less risk around it. In the anime though, and yes, it is a very small change, but it does kinda insinuate that the rumbling genuinely could have started here for all they know. But regardless, the step-by-step plan of first bopping the walls, second watching for a reaction, third using the chaos as a distraction to infiltrate the walls, and fourth then finding the king is consistent between the two versions. The other crucial part here is another part of Reiner dying. As he again proclaims that they are the chosen warriors bringing the world's judgment to Paradis, Marcel just apologizes. This time, coming clean that he sabotaged Porco and Reiner wasn't meant to be picked. We get this incredible panning shot, one where time itself becomes wrong and inconsistent. In the same way we saw the colors fade for Gabby, we go from this dark night to him being exposed to the light of the morning. The rays of sun cutting through those layers of lies. This is where Reiner's world as he knew it died. He was never meant to be a warrior. Becoming a warrior changed nothing. His mother is left alone with a son who will die in 13 years, and his armor couldn't even protect their squad. Everything he dreamed of, everything he pushed through, all led to yet another hell. And we again get that paradox within Reiner, with him asking, why are you apologizing? And here, I think there are a few ways of looking at it. I think one part of Reiner is asking this because he genuinely doesn't understand why anyone would ever apologize for helping someone become a warrior. It's the single greatest honor for an Eldian, isn't it? Even right here, right now, Marcel is giving his life for Reiner, so why would he apologize? The training was every man for himself. Why would the leader of the group apologize? And finally, and I think this is the actual intended meaning, the apology is a terrifying confirmation for Reiner. A confirmation that he was not worthy. Confirmation that him being here was a mistake. Confirmation that nothing he has ever done has actually amounted to anything. And so when Marcel gets eaten, Reiner's psyche cracks completely because he knows he will never get that validation. For the rest of his life, Marcel saving him, a weakling and a mistake, will replay in his mind with that same question. Why him? Why did he survive? If everything he did was for nothing, then why did Marcel have to die? This is absolute cinema, I have nothing else to add. Except, boo, be scared, CG horses are back. We cut to Reiner alone, just holding onto a tree and desperately gasping for a breath, but immediately throwing up. Eventually, Annie does show up and gives him a solid kick, saying that for the first time ever, he beat her in a long-distance race. That is obviously a backhanded compliment, implying that the only thing that is actually making him go fast is fear and cowardice. And also note that it is Annie who immediately takes the lead, not Reiner as you might expect. She immediately starts making calls, saying, we need to go back ASAP, we could have saved Marcel if we transform, but it is what it is. Then just saying that they need to find Emir, who would have now obviously transformed back to her human form. But as she says this, we get these close-ups of Reiner's mortified face. There's another back and forth here, but the important thing is that constant contradiction within Reiner. On one hand, he is deathly afraid of going back. Annie saying that he'll be stripped of his armor has him sweating bullets because, you know, death. It's the same thing we saw with him eating the Thunder Spears. When it came down to it, there is the primal, no, I don't want to die. But at the same time, there is also the very explicit, I should not have lived that day. I know I always babble on about this, but this is why I always love the way Isayama wrote his characters. It's these contradictions that actually make them feel human. In a ton of stories, I think characters adhere to, like, a single principle almost too much, and whenever they deviate from it, people will immediately say that it is out of character. In Attack on Titan though, just like with real people, they are messy. There is a desire to just throw everything away, to just give up and say that, frankly, this is not worth it. But at the same time, there is that burning fire within him, anger and disappointment in himself, and frankly just spite. If nothing matters and he wants to just give it up, well then, he might as well just give it his all, because if he loses and nothing matters, well then, he loses, but until then, he will keep fighting. And we of course see this all over, with Mikasa's life is cruel but beautiful, with Eren's keep moving forward, with Kenny's everyone is a slave to something, etc, etc. Every single person, both in Attack on Titan as well as the real world, without exception, is a hypocrite. Every person is, in many ways, a walking contradiction. And I think with scenes like these, Attack on Titan just captured that flawlessly. But wait, because Isayama keeps on cooking. As Reiner starts yapping that they must complete the mission and that they too would be punished, Annie's coping mechanism of kicking things kicks in, and she lets her mask slip. She blatantly says that she doesn't care about any of this, that Marleyans and Eldians are one and the same, and that the only thing she wants is to go back home. Again, you can call her sadistic or whatever you want, but out of everyone here, she is the only one actually being honest with herself. To her, there is no fantasy of becoming a warrior and of saving my people. No. She straight up says, yeah, this world is bad, they are bad, you are bad, and you know what? In a bad world, of course I'll be bad as well. If the world is a circus, you might as well become a clown, right? And as usual, the soundtrack here is excellent. But wait, there is even more. Reiner manages to actually tackle her. As he chokes her out, he proclaims that Reiner is dead. If you need Marcel, I'll be Marcel. I've spent far too much time already talking about Reiner's split/dissociative personalities, so here I'll just say that the actual execution of that moment is incredible. We obviously already know that eventually this shield cracks completely and he becomes a mess. And we also see him getting full-blown panic attacks in Liberio. So I think seeing this moment where it really was all or nothing for him, and how that young mind can totally warp reality itself is both extremely chilling as well as just, well, it's great writing. Also, this is the fight that Reiner mentioned back in Season 1 when he was trying to flex on Annie. Clearly, he didn't realize that choking someone out from behind and an actual fair duel are not exactly the same, because, well, you know. And also, the animation of Annie's bloodshot eye is excellent. The Mappa eyes, they never miss. And the final thing here, note that all of this happens under a tree. This obviously is not the Shiganshina tree, but I do think the parallel here is intentional. For Eren's squad, the tree represented safety and the trio's bond. The place where they could just chase each other and all laugh. A memory that they would return to many times throughout. For Marley's trio, on the other hand, it represented death in more ways than one. It was the death of Marcel, it was the death of Reiner, and it was the death of hope. Even before breaching Shiganshina, the dreamer Reiner who would just save this world is done. Very much like Eren, but also very different. Finally, we cut on over to the fall of Shiganshina, only this time, of course, from Marley's point of view. A small thing here that I think most people don't think twice about is Dina passing by Bertolt, because hey, it happens, right? Titans should attack people, but there have been quite a few times where they do wander around a little bit and miss people, so it's totally possible. Thing is, we know that this is not in fact just a random goofy outcome and that Dina was being diverted by Eren. And thing is, Bertolt himself acknowledges that as being weird in this very scene. He is confused by it just passing by him. Also, I again have to mention the anime cutting a whole bunch of stuff from the manga. Their entire journey here and why Annie isn't doing anything is made a lot more clear, so in case you're still confused about a few of these things, I would definitely recommend at least skimming through the manga pages. As we cut to Reiner, we get that "be careful what you wish for" message. As Reiner charges the wall, he says all he wanted was to fulfill his mother's dream. But it was all hopeless, saying, "I should have never become a warrior." And if you allow me to do a little bit of non-linear storytelling, our very own Eren would echo the same exact message at the end of this episode. He talks about how, if anyone knew where they'd end up, no one would ever set foot on a battlefield. Reiner signed his own death warrants for false hope, one that would completely and utterly break him. Had he known the toll the Paradis campaign would have taken on him, surely he'd just stay with his mother and never pursue the warriors at all. But just like Eren would then add, people who push themselves onward see a different sort of hell. They're looking past that hell. It might be hope, or it might be yet another hell. The whole "the ends justify the means" argument is another major throughline in the story, and one that permeates both Eren's as well as Reiner's stories, with him moments later also saying that he can't give up without understanding a thing. Spoilers, both of them tried pushing through that hell and saw something infinitely worse because it's all a constant escalation of misery. So, yeah. Also, the Season 4 videos seem to have found a new audience. Welcome to the channel. But with that, I've noticed a weird number of comments asking, why are you talking about Reiner? He's clearly attacking Eren. Eren is the victim in this situation, you know? And like, yes, obviously, this attack should have never happened. Reiner is not a good guy. None of this is good. When I talk about Reiner being a hero wanting to save the world, I think it's pretty obvious that I'm not calling him a hero. I am talking about his and Eren's conversation, where that is literally what they talk about, that they are the same, and that both of them just wanted to save the world. So, just as a reminder, do not get lost in the sauce. Eren is absolutely a victim, and what Reiner did is irredeemable. But Reiner is also a victim, and what Marley did to him is also irredeemable. Both of them made choices. Some of those choices were really bad and blatantly wrong. Some of those choices they made as kids. Some of them they made as adults. That is why in Season 4 we have characters like Gabby who, even as a kid, realizes that everything she was told was in fact complete lies. She realizes that the only thing they're doing is continuing the cycle. But on the opposite side, we have a character like Flock, who, even though he's an adult and clearly realizes what he's doing, is still going scorched earth even on civilians. So again, do not get lost in the sauce. When we talk about these characters, we don't want to redeem them, we just want to understand them. After the fall of Moria, we see them wake up in Wall Rose, with Eren's Trio 2 sitting in the distance. And we'd also see them shortly after in one of the crowd shots back in Season 1. And just like with Eren's trio, we then smash cut to him among the soldiers saying that he is here to save humanity. Don't think I really need to elaborate on the double meaning here. Cutting on over to the eye catcher, it gives us a bit more detail about the warrior candidates. This is just another example of that quote-unquote honorary Marleyan thing being extremely shallow and being there to purely sow tribalism and division among the Eldians. Oh hey, the Eldians are bad, but we will tolerate just this certain group of them because they can be extremely powerful weapons for us, but no, all of them are still bad. I wish I could say that was funny, but it's also kind of very real, so not very funny. Another through line in this episode is of course wearing masks and basically stealing other stories. The obvious one is of course Reiner becoming Marcel. But we also have Bertolt stealing this dude's story. He told this story basically verbatim to Eren back in Season 1, but just swapped out the main dude with himself. Yes, he isekai'd himself into this dude's story. In the meantime, Annie is doing a whole bunch of shenanigans within Walsina and is trailing Kenny. Problem is, Kenny is also a bit of a gigachad when it comes to reconnaissance, so trying to trail him, not a good idea, and they end up in a whole confrontation. Annie tries saying that she's like a long-lost daughter of Kenny's, but none of it works. What's very cool though is that she literally kicks through a brick, so that's pretty cool, I guess. But yeah, all of this loops right back to Season 1 where she was the only one to pursue the MPs because she was trying to get close to the king, and because she found Kenny, she must have actually been really close. We also finally see Bertolt's weird sleeping patterns that we heard about back in Season 2. I already talked about it with the whole hanged man imagery, so just give that video a look. We then cut to just before the fall of Trost, with Annie once again reporting her findings and saying that she almost got caught. And importantly, she again stresses that they should just go back to Marley. This takes us back all the way to Trost and that odd 4-year wait period. Most of those questions are answered here. It took them a while to get into the military, then it took a bit more time for Annie to actually figure out what's going on and even start attempting to get close to the king, which, by the way, wouldn't have even mattered because he was a fake. Then they needed more time for Annie to actually get into the MPs and into Walsina, and by that point, we are already into the main story. So they weren't just sitting around for those 4 years, they were actually doing stuff, but just like none of it really did anything, so Trost it is. You break another wall, you concentrate the population even further, and maybe there will be a reaction. And while that reaction did not come from the king in the least, and it wasn't even planned by Marley at all, there was in fact a reaction from the founder, that of course being Eren. So it kind of worked. And on the flip side, we have Reiner making the very solid point that they can't return because they came to the island, immediately lost one of Marley's shifters to, presumably, the enemy, then set the enemy on wartime footing by attacking Moria, didn't get any valuable information on the king, and would basically come back home with the technological gap already closing, and not only nothing to show for it, but also the net loss of the jaw. So if they went back like right after losing the jaw, maybe Marley would have been like, okay, we need to send an actual unit over there. But at this point, if they go back after 5 years, I mean, they would all lose their titans instantly. So yes, Wall Rose it is, and it doesn't really work because they get no information on the founder, but Eren does transform, so we'll call that like a 50-50. And I mentioned it earlier, but it's here where Annie says that attacking Wall Rose means killing a whole bunch of his friends. Reiner would of course insist that they are not my friends, that they are all devils, yada yada, but well, we saw what happened with Marco. And we also get a very small but honestly quite touching scene of Reiner just apologizing to Annie for pushing her so hard. For what I think are obvious reasons, throughout the first 2 seasons, we don't really see them interact in any meaningful way in terms of like personal connections. So actually seeing that behind all of their shady plans and behind all the Reiner personas, there are these moments of, I'm sorry, I wish you didn't have to do this, and I wish we could just go back. I think it just really humanizes all of them. And speaking of, as they're about to split up again, Bertolt says that he's having the same dream all the time. A dream of that man who, you know, himself back at the farm. With him then saying, I can't help but wonder why he told us that story before he tied the noose. First off, note that when we get the shot of all of them reacting, Annie is actively looking away. I suppose you could read it as indifference, that like she doesn't even bother to look, but personally, judging by our reaction to what happened to Marco, I think she doesn't want to look. So again, like we already talked about, I don't think she is fascinated by violence or anything like that. But number 2, think about just how ridiculous what Bertolt is saying actually is. He keeps having a nightmare about this single dude, while he himself has already killed hundreds of thousands. In my far too long retrospective video on the series as a whole, I talk about this plenty more, but this is what I mean when I talk about personifying this mass destruction. When I say the fall of Moria, that is not just like a historical event that happened and wow, it changed Eren's story. No, that meant the death of 250,000 people. But for Bertolt, it's not until he sees this single man and the toll his actions have taken on him that it actually resonates with him. It's the same thing we saw with Reiner and Marco, it's the same thing we would still see with Reiner and Eren, and it's the same thing that we would eventually see with Ramsay and Eren. It's the same thing for us as the viewers. The fall of Moria, the fall of Rose, even the rumbling. All of these things are sort of these abstract events and abstract forces that change the story. But it's not until we get that one single personification of what it actually means that I think the true weight actually sinks in. And on a very, very similar note, we cut to this beautiful sunset as the soldiers all zip through the forest. Eren comes crashing down to the ground, with Reiner telling him to just take a breath. Eren, though, just like the young Reiner, is angry at himself. He asks, "How can I be like you and Mikasa?" saying that, at this rate, I will never accomplish a single thing. This is where I think the final piece in Reiner's entire grand life plan collapsed. His family wasn't meant to be. He wasn't meant to be a warrior. He wasn't meant to complete the mission. But as he kept moving forward and kept attacking these people, trying to grasp at some kind of hope, he realized that the people here, they weren't devils. He was looking at himself on the ground, saying, I will never achieve anything. I will never be able to save my people. This is the memory that is rattling around his brain. And so we cut to Reiner looking at a rifle round. And then back to them in this heavenly light. He loads the magazine and tells Eren to just keep moving forward. He cycles around into the chamber, and we see their clasped hands as he just says, that's just how it works, right? This dissonant, chilling piano plays as Reiner cheers Eren on. He says, if anyone can kill the Titans, then it has to be you. We fade from that heavenly light and this brotherly bond to the barred window. We go from the peaceful setting summer sun to Reiner being in a cage of his own making. The last rays of the light falling through the small window. Luckily for me, this scene is so good that Isayama basically said, don't worry, you don't even need to think about this, Eren will explain this entire thing in just a moment, so sit back, relax, and we'll get to this in a second. But yes, if we talked about Reiner's panic attack when he thought about the people he couldn't protect and the people who are now either dead or captured, then here we see him actually deal with the guilt of what he has done. This scene essentially tells us that, no matter how weird it may sound, the person Reiner actually needs to hear from is Eren. In the same way, his question of, why are you apologizing, was this haunting confirmation for him, meeting Eren face to face and hearing that he is just as horrible as he thinks he is, would finally give him peace of mind. Thing is, once they actually meet in Liberio, Eren's reaction is very, very different. And that scene is like, oh my god, I can't wait to talk about it. Just as Reiner goes to pull the trigger, Falco suddenly hits the wall screaming out, at this rate, I won't make the cut. Reiner's entire, I'm not going to become a warrior, I'm going to fail, Eren's whole, at this rate I won't do anything, and Falco's, I won't make the cut, is another narrative thread that connects all of them, and we'll talk about that plenty more. In this situation though, Falco is just that one small glimmer of hope. That one thing that he can still tell himself that he has and is worth protecting. But as Falco walks off, we see Eren call out to him. After Falco says that he's happy to at least hear him talking, Eren explains that he faked it all. He doesn't have PTSD, he doesn't have amnesia, he doesn't have anything. Then just saying that he kept acting because he can't face his family anymore. I think here we have two very, very different meanings. One of them is just a convenient lie, and that's it. But the other is him actually being 100% truthful. He can't face his family anymore. After the coronation, he already became cold and distant. But then he crossed the sea and he met Ramsay. It's after that conversation, after spending that night with all the locals, that he could never go back again. He could never tell people on Paradis that what he's doing is for them, because that is putting the burden of this horrifying thing on their shoulders. He could never do that. And so yes, him saying that he kept up this act is true to an extent, because he is wearing a mask. Eren then says that he's glad Falco wouldn't be making the cuts, saying that he is a good person and that he wishes he lives a long life. We've talked plenty about this before, but this is of course the same thing that Eren wishes for all of his friends. He doesn't want anyone to inherit his Titans because that would mean they die in 13 years. And it being Falco, someone on the quote-unquote other side, of course very much carries a much more loaded meaning. Though if we were to overanalyze a little bit, there is kind of the question of, does Eren inadvertently talk about something that he shouldn't really be talking about? As in, does the public actually know the ins and outs of the 13-year curse? I guess it is only natural that eventually they would realize that, wait, all the Titan shifters, they all die within 13 years? Probably there is something that must happen, right? But at the same time, Eren's so casually talking about how I want you to live a long life, obviously saying that he knows about the curse, could actually be him talking about something that is kinda classified. No idea if that's an actual thing though, I'm completely making this up, it's just something that I was thinking about could maybe be classified because like, it's all Titan stuff, right? But Falco then explains that he wants to make sure that he gets it over someone else, that of course being Gabby. Eren even asks, is this someone a girl perhaps? So he obviously knows what's going on here. I think this is another example of both Gabby and Falco being parts and deconstructions of Eren, and this is one of those. Clearly, he does see a part of himself in Falco. It's a naive and silly side, but it is a side of him. At this point in the story, he has pushed that side of himself far, far away. But once upon a time, and not even that recently, he did talk about just wrapping Mika's scarf. And on top of all of that, there is also the tragic undertone here of Eren wanting him to live a long life, but then he talks about saving his friend. And suddenly, you have a good old Attack on Titan paradox, because both outcomes are really bad, and both outcomes are very familiar to Eren. But Eren then talks about how all this time he has just been thinking, how did they end up this way? Bodies, minds, personalities, all withered away. Then saying that, if anyone knew what it was like, no one would ever set foot on a battlefield. Apparently, Eren is a philosopher because while he might be talking to a kid about, war is bad, there is so much to unpack here. Number one is that conversation he'd have with Reiner. After he reached Marley and realized that the people here are just like him, he kept asking the question of, why would they ever attack Paradis? Why did they end up like this? It's the same people waging war because of some other. And here he is, mere days away from waging that same war. He understands that there is no end to this. The brutally oppressed Reiner, who wanted to save the world, attacked Paradis. The brutally oppressed Eren, who wanted to save his world, attacked Marley. And in the end, both sides were broken. So why? How did they end up like this? Why did this even start? And very similarly, number two, I think it's commentary on conflict as a whole. Talking about justice and freedoms and old grudges is easy. But when it comes to war, it's over. You win or you die. Once that wheel is spun, it will keep spinning until there is no wheel. If the ones talking about waging these wars had ever felt it on their own mind and body, no one would ever step foot on the battlefield. But Eren then adds, something pushes them onward, and they walk all the way into hell anyway. Usually, that something isn't their own free will. Been a long time since we've talked about inherited conflict, so here it is again. Most of Season 3 dealt with the question of what is free will if once you're born, like 90% of your decisions have already been made for you. When Eren talks about how the conditions and people around them left them with no choice, it's very easy to say that, no, you did have a choice and accountability lies with you. But when people are put in that same position, they spin that wheel. Again, it's a fictional world, so it's easy for us to sit here and talk about how Reiner should have immediately realized that Marley's story is sus and all of that. But at a certain point, I think that is genuinely just starting to deny the reality of how people actually work. Acting in self-interest, or at least the interest of your close little family, is how people survived for thousands of years. It's just a natural thing that we do. So yes, while removing accountability from a person and their actions is extremely dangerous, I also think ignoring those conditions and the people around them that might have shaped them into something potentially really, really bad that now must take accountability for something really, really bad is just as dangerous. Obviously, your environment will change the way you behave. There's a reason why it takes generations for people to actually change. But yes, after all those loops and roundabouts, he is also of course talking about himself. When he talks about the conditions and people that left him with no choice and that he pushes through that hell and maybe there's another hell, he is talking about the attack on Marley and then the rumbling and maybe whatever lies beyond that. Very, very big picture-wise though, I think this entire conversation is an exploration of the duality of Eren and Reiner. Eren's core nature is closer to Gabby, but I think he wants to be like Falco, while Reiner is much more like Falco, but he has always wished to be a Gabby. And so right in the middle, you have these conversations of, I don't want my friends to inherit the Titan. Falco, you must save Gabby from this grim fate. But at the same time, beyond that hell that both Eren and Reiner march through, there might be hope. Or maybe yet another hell. That is the meaning of keep moving forward. The same unrelenting march in pursuit of a dream, in pursuit of hope that we've seen many, many times before. Or, in the words of Kenny, everyone was a slave to something. And with that, that is episode 62. This video turned out to be way longer than I ever expected, and if you ever doubted my commitment to this series, it is literally New Year's Eve when I'm recording this, so I am here always. When is this being published? Oh, Christmas Eve. All that being said, now it is time for Liberio, and I think the next couple of episodes are going to be very, very long as well. So I guess I'll just say thank you for joining me for another year of overanalyzing Attack on Titan, and let's see if we can wrap this thing up in 2025. So I hope to see you back as we continue overanalyzing Attack on Titan. And that's the video. This video is already way too long, so no more yapping from me. The only thing I'll say is that the Dark Souls streams are still going on the second channel, along with all my other yappers, and I have a few things planned for New Year's as well, so if you happen to be bored, swing by, I'll be there. Other than that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest members of the team, Paxton, Mapo Tofu, and XJS Videos. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my rambling, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day and a happy new year, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.